If Earth were placed beside a black hole, the sky would break first. The horizon would not stay level. Light would begin to bend around a darkness too dense to see directly, and the sun would no longer appear where it should. The ground beneath your feet would still feel solid for a moment, but the world would already be entering a field where direction no longer behaves normally. There would be no impact, no sudden collision. Only a quiet distortion spreading through everything you use to understand position. The planet would still be there, but it would already be too close. That is the first mistake the mind tries to make. It imagines a black hole as an object nearby, something Earth could approach while remaining the same world in a different location. But proximity at this scale does not simply change distance, it changes the structure the planet is moving through. Earth would not be travelling beside an extreme object. It would be entering a region where gravity begins to reorganise the meaning of orbit, direction, and return. What appears at first like a world passing near danger is already something else, a planet being drawn into a geometry that does not allow ordinary motion to remain ordinary. And once that geometry takes hold, the question is no longer how close Earth is. The question is what kind of world can still exist there at all. The ground beneath you still feels complete. It holds your weight, remains level, and gives no immediate sign that anything has changed. The sky is still recognizable, the horizon still forms a line, and every object around you behaves as expected. But that stability depends on a condition you cannot see. Everything must be moving together. The air, the surface, the oceans, the entire planet, all of it following the same path so precisely that no difference can be detected. This is what stillness actually is. Not the absence of motion, but the absence of separation. And at this distance, there is still no separation. Earth has already entered the gravitational field of something far more massive than itself. Not close enough to tear it apart, not yet, but close enough that the path it follows is no longer its own. The change does not begin with impact. It begins with alignment. The planet is no longer orbiting freely. Its trajectory is being redirected, gently at first, into a curvature that does not belong to Earth or to the Sun, but to something ahead that is already shaping the space around it. You do not feel this redirection, because the ground is following it with you. Imagine the surface beneath you becoming slightly misaligned, even by a fraction. The air would begin to shift, the horizon would tilt, objects would no longer fall in straight lines, the illusion would collapse immediately. But that does not happen, because the entire planet is adjusting as one. This is the first visible condition of being too close. Nothing breaks. Nothing announces itself. The system simply stops behaving independently. The sun no longer defines the dominant structure of motion. The Earth is no longer moving within a stable orbital balance. Instead, both are being drawn into a larger geometry, one that does not produce sudden force, but continuous redirection. And that redirection accumulates. Paths that once closed now begin to drift. Motions that once repeated no longer return to the same positions. The planet is not falling in any direction you can point to, but its trajectory is no longer stable. It is being reshaped. If you could observe this from far enough away, you would see the difference immediately. The orbit would no longer appear circular. The motion would begin to stretch, to lean, to align toward a single region of space that dominates everything around it. That region does not need to be visible. It only needs to exist. Because once its influence reaches this far, the idea of standing on a stable world becomes conditional. The ground still feels solid, but it is no longer independent. It is part of a system that has already begun to reorganize itself around something much larger, much denser, and much closer than it should be. If the ground is already carrying you along a hidden path, The next assumption is that this path still behaves like an orbit, a curve that bends but eventually returns. This is how motion is usually understood. A planet moves, but it closes its path, it repeats, it preserves its distance. Even when it falls in a way that never quite arrives. But that kind of orbit depends on a very specific condition. Balance. A balance between motion that carries outward and gravity that pulls inward. A precise relationship that allows a path to curve without collapsing. The Earth you are familiar with exists inside that balance, moving around the Sun in a shape that closes on itself again and again. That closure is what makes the system feel stable. But the path you are now inside is not closing. The curvature beneath you is not symmetrical. It does not bend space in a way that allows for easy return. Instead, it creates a gradient, a difference that grows stronger as you move along it. At first, that difference is almost impossible to detect. The planet continues forward, its motion smooth, its rotation unchanged. Days pass, oceans shift, winds move across continents. Everything appears to behave as it always has. But the path is no longer repeating. It is drifting. Not outward, not randomly, but inward along a curve that does not circle back. This is the second fracture. An orbit that does not close is not an orbit. It is a descent. The geometry has changed. What once would have been a stable loop is now a stretched trajectory, one side of it slightly tighter than the other. Each pass brings the planet a little closer to the region shaping its motion. Not enough to feel immediately, but enough that the pattern no longer repeats exactly. There is no perfect return. Each revolution becomes a subtle deviation from the last. And those deviations accumulate. Imagine drawing a circle, but each time you complete it, the line shifts inward by a distance too small to notice. At first it looks unchanged, but over time the circle tightens, spiraling slowly toward a center that was never part of the original shape. That is the path Earth is now following. Not a circle, but a tightening curve. The ground beneath you continues to feel stable because the change is distributed across the entire system. There is no sudden drop, no sharp turn, only a continuous adjustment in direction, guided by a curvature that deepens as you move through it. You do not feel the path bending. You feel only the surface that follows it. From above, if you could see the trajectory traced by the planet, it would no longer resemble the clean, repeating shape you expect. It would appear stretched, skewed, slowly leaning toward a point that exerts influence without visible form. A center that does not emit light. A region that does not reflect. Yet everything around it is being organized by its presence. The path is not chosen. It is shaped. And once a path begins to tighten, the idea of distance changes with it. The planet may still appear far from whatever is guiding this motion, but distance in a curved space is not what it seems. What looks like separation can conceal a connection that grows stronger with every moment. You are not simply far away, moving safely along a predictable route. You are already on a trajectory that is being rewritten. The familiar map of motion, circle, return, repetition, no longer applies. Instead, the planet is tracing a line that does not close. A path that slowly narrows. A motion that carries everything forward while quietly removing the possibility of going back. What felt like orbit was only temporary balance. And that balance is already beginning to fail. If the path is tightening, then something must be shaping it. Not from a distance, not as a single point pulling everything inward, but as an environment that surrounds the motion itself. The change you are inside does not come from a force reaching across empty space. It comes from the structure of the space you are already moving through. This is the part that remains hidden. Because space does not look different when it changes. There is no color, no texture, no visible boundary marking where flatness ends and curvature begins. The air remains clear, the sky appears unchanged, the stars still occupy familiar positions, at least for now. But the geometry beneath all of it has been altered. What you are moving through is no longer a neutral background. It is a shaped region. Imagine space not as an empty stage, but as something that can bend, deepen, and organize motion without announcing itself. A surface that does not need edges to guide what moves across it. Instead, it redirects every path from within. This is the third fracture. You are not moving through space. You are moving within a structure. The black hole does not simply sit somewhere ahead, waiting as a destination. Its presence extends outward, not as an object you approach, but as a condition that already surrounds you. A region where every possible direction has been subtly adjusted. Straight lines no longer remain straight. They drift. Light itself begins to curve, though not yet enough to distort what you see dramatically. Photons leaving distant stars arrive at your eyes along paths that are slightly altered, bending just enough to match the structure they pass through. The sky is already being rewritten, but too slowly to notice. The deeper effect is not visual. It is directional. Every movement, every trajectory, every orbit is being guided by this curvature, not pushed, not pulled in the way you imagine gravity as a force, but redirected continuously. The difference is quiet, but it changes everything. Because once space is shaped, motion has no choice but to follow. The planet beneath you is not resisting this shape. It cannot. Its mass, its momentum, its entire existence is already committed to the geometry it occupies. There is no alternative path available, because all possible paths have been altered in the same direction. You are not choosing where to go. The structure has already decided. If you could trace a straight beam of light outward from your position, it would not remain straight. It would arc, slowly at first, then more noticeably as it travels. Not because something deflects it midway, but because the space it moves through is already curved. There is no deviation, only compliance with the structure. This is why the environment feels unchanged. Because the change is not happening to objects. It is happening to the stage those objects exist within. And a stage does not announce its transformation to the actors standing on it. From your perspective, everything remains consistent. Distances seem intact, directions appear reliable, up, down, forward, these still feel meaningful. But beneath those labels, the relationships between directions are shifting. What was once perpendicular is no longer perfectly so. What was once parallel will eventually meet. The map you rely on is beginning to fold. Not visibly, but structurally. And once a map begins to fold, the idea of moving freely across it becomes an illusion, because every step you take is already being guided along a path that leads deeper into the same structure. You are not approaching the black hole as an object. You are already inside the region that defines it. The environment has changed, and you did not cross a boundary to enter it. Once the environment begins to change, the effects do not arrive all at once. They appear uneven, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Because what is being altered is not just motion, but the way different parts of the same system experience that motion. The planet beneath you is still intact, still rotating, still holding its shape, but the rules governing that shape are no longer uniform across its surface. This is where consequence begins. Gravity is no longer equal everywhere. Not in the way you are used to. On one side of the planet, the pull is slightly stronger. on the opposite side slightly weaker. The difference is small at first, too small to tear anything apart, but large enough to begin stretching the structure of the planet itself. A quiet distortion. The oceans respond first. Water does not resist shape, it redistributes. Tides begin to rise in ways that no longer follow the familiar rhythm of the moon. Instead, they align with a deeper gradient, one that points toward a direction you cannot see from the surface. The oceans are leaning. Continents follow more slowly. Rock resists change, but not indefinitely. Over time, the crust begins to flex, almost imperceptibly, adjusting to a force that is no longer symmetrical. What once held steady now begins to shift under a pressure that has no visible source. But the most unsettling change is not in the ground. It is in time. Time does not pass at the same rate everywhere anymore. At first, the difference is too small to measure without instruments. Clocks remain aligned, seconds pass as expected, and nothing in daily experience seems altered. But the deeper structure has already changed. Regions closer to the direction of curvature begin to experience time differently than those farther away. Not by stopping, but by diverging. Two identical processes, occurring in different parts of the planet, no longer remain perfectly synchronized. One lags behind the other, not because it's slowed down in any absolute sense, but because the environment it exists within has changed the rate at which time unfolds. The difference accumulates. Slowly. Silently. You would not notice it directly. No sensation marks the shift. But over long durations the discrepancy grows. Signals sent across the planet take on slight inconsistencies. Rhythms that once aligned begin to drift. The planet is no longer sharing a single time. This is the fourth fracture. Uniformity is gone. Light begins to reveal it next. Photons travelling across the planet from one region to another carry subtle changes in energy. Light moving against the direction of curvature loses energy, stretching slightly, shifting toward longer wavelengths. Light moving with it gains energy, compressing as it travels. The change is small, but measurable. Colours are no longer perfectly consistent across distance. The sky begins to behave differently depending on where you look. Stars near the direction of curvature appear slightly shifted, their positions bending in ways that do not match any known pattern of motion. The distortion is faint, easy to dismiss, but it does not remain static. It evolves as the planet continues along its path. The sky is no longer a fixed reference. It is responding. And all of this is happening while the ground still feels solid beneath you. While buildings stand. While air moves across landscapes. While life continues. Because the system has not broken. It has only begun to differentiate. The planet is no longer a uniform object moving through empty space. It is a structure being stretched across a gradient, experiencing different conditions at different points, all at once. You are still being carried. But not all parts of the system are being carried the same way. And that difference, once it begins, does not reverse. It increases. What felt like a single world is becoming a set of regions, each following the same path, but not sharing the same experience of it. The change is not sudden. It is layered. And once layers begin to separate, the idea of a single, unified Earth starts to dissolve. If the planet is no longer uniform, then it is no longer behaving as a single object. It only appears that way from within. From the surface, everything still feels connected. The ground continues beneath your feet, the horizon still curves around you, and the sky stretches above as one continuous field. But these are local agreements. They do not reflect the structure the planet now belongs to. Because the planet is no longer defined by itself. It is being defined by something larger. This is the fifth fracture. Earth is not near the black hole. It is already part of its system. The idea of proximity suggests separation. It suggests that there is Earth, and somewhere else there is the black hole, two objects with distance between them. But that model no longer holds once the environment itself has changed. There is no clear boundary where the black hole begins. There is only a region where its influence organizes everything. And Earth is inside that region. What you are standing on is not an isolated world moving freely through space. It is matter following a trajectory that has already been shaped by a much deeper structure. A structure that extends far beyond anything you can see from the surface. The planet is not orbiting in the way you expect. It is participating. Participating in a system where motion is not optional, where paths are not chosen, and where every object is part of a larger flow. The curvature you are moving through is not just guiding the planet's path. It is integrating the planet into a network of motion that includes everything nearby. Other matter is there. Not always visible, not always luminous, but present. Gas, dust, fragments of other objects that have already entered this region. All of it following similar trajectories, all of it responding to the same underlying structure. The black hole is not a point pulling from afar. It is the center of an active system. And Earth is no longer outside it. From a wider perspective, the planet would not appear as a stable sphere moving along a clean path. It would appear as a participant in a dynamic environment, one where trajectories bend, intersect, and gradually converge. A system of inward motion. This is where the idea of isolation fails. You are not on a separate world. You are inside a process. The planet's identity as a self-contained object begins to dissolve when viewed this way. Its motion cannot be described independently anymore. Its future cannot be separated from the structure it is embedded within. Every aspect of its behavior, its orbit, its rotation, even the way time passes across it, is now linked to something beyond itself. There is no independent Earth in this situation. Only Earth within a system. And systems do not preserve individual stability. They organize change. This is why the earlier changes, the uneven gravity, the shifting time, the distortion of light, are not anomalies. They are not temporary disturbances that will settle back into equilibrium. They are the natural behavior of matter inside a gravitational structure that is far more complex than a simple orbit. The planet is being incorporated. Not suddenly, not violently, but inevitably. Its path is aligning with others. Its motion is synchronizing with a larger pattern. And that pattern does not include stable return. If you could step far enough away to see the entire configuration, you would not see Earth as a destination or a center. You would see it as one trajectory among many, each one bending inward, each one part of a shared flow toward a region where the structure becomes even more extreme. You would see convergence. Not as a point you approach, but as a condition that organizes everything before it arrives. The black hole is not waiting. It is already shaping. And Earth is no longer something that might encounter it. It is something that has already entered its domain. What felt like a place was only a temporary coherence. Now it is part of a system that does not preserve places. Only motion. If Earth is already part of a larger system, then remaining on its surface is no longer enough to understand what is happening. The ground hides too much. Its stability is local. Its perspective is limited. Every distortion you have felt so far has been filtered through a frame that is moving with you. To see the structure more clearly, you have to leave that frame behind. So the perspective shifts. Not physically, but conceptually. Imagine rising away from the surface, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the orbit of satellites, until the planet is no longer something you stand on, but something you observe. A sphere suspended in motion, carrying its oceans, its continents, its atmosphere, all of it still intact, but no longer central. From here, the illusion weakens. Earth does not appear stationary. It does not even appear stable. Its path is visible now, not as a perfect curve, but as a trajectory that bends more sharply on one side than the other. A motion that does not repeat, but tightens. The planet is not circling in balance. It is leaning into a direction that becomes more defined the farther it travels. You can see the asymmetry. One side of the planet faces deeper curvature, the other faces a region that is less distorted. The difference is subtle in shape, but absolute in consequence. The entire planet is being carried through a gradient that is not evenly distributed. It is entering a slope that has no surface. This is where motion becomes visible. Not as speed, but as change in direction. From this distance, the path of Earth is no longer a line you can extend outward into the future and expect to return. It folds inward. Each moment of motion brings it into a region where the curvature increases, where the geometry becomes more extreme. The planet is not just moving, it is being redirected continuously. Around it, the environment begins to reveal itself. Light from distant stars no longer travels in straight paths. Instead, it curves around an unseen center, creating subtle arcs in the background. The sky, from this perspective, is no longer a fixed dome. It is a field being shaped by the same structure guiding the planet. Stars shift position without moving. Patterns distort without breaking. The background is no longer reliable. And Earth is not separate from this. It is embedded within the same distortion, following one of many possible paths that all share a common direction. Other trajectories exist nearby, invisible threads of motion traced by particles, by radiation, by matter that has already been drawn deeper into the system. You begin to see the network. Not as lines you can touch, but as a pattern of movement. Everything is bending. Everything is aligning. There is no random motion here, no independent path. Each trajectory, including Earth's, is part of a larger flow that organizes matter according to the curvature of space itself. This is not an orbiting system. It is a converging one. From this perspective, the idea of distance changes again. Earth may still appear far from the central region, but the paths connecting it to that region are already defined. The curvature links them. What looks like separation is actually continuity. There is no empty space between, only shaped space. And within that shape, motion is not free. It is guided. You can trace Earth's future now, not as a prediction, but as a consequence. Its trajectory will continue to bend. The asymmetry will increase. The environment will become more extreme, and the planet will move into regions where the effects you have only begun to notice will intensify. There is no stable region ahead, only deeper structure. From the surface, you felt carried. From here, you can see the carrying. The planet is not choosing its path. It is following one that has already been written into the geometry of the space it occupies. And every moment it continues, that path becomes more difficult to escape, not because of speed, but because the structure itself leaves no alternative. Earth is not drifting near something. It is already inside a system that is closing around it. From a distance, the planet appears unified. A single sphere moving along a single path, carrying everything with it. But that unity is only visual. It depends on compressing differences that are already beginning to separate. Because time is no longer shared evenly across the system. This is where the structure becomes difficult to ignore. Imagine two clocks placed on opposite sides of the planet. identical in every way, synchronized perfectly at the start. Under normal conditions, they would remain aligned, each second passing in agreement with the other. But the environment you are inside no longer allows that agreement to hold. One side of the planet is deeper in the curvature. The other is slightly less so. That difference changes how time unfolds. The clock closer to the deeper region begins to fall behind. Not suddenly, not in a way that can be seen moment to moment, but steadily. Each second it measures stretches just enough that over time, the difference becomes undeniable. The other clock continues. Faster. Not by accelerating, but by existing in a region where time is less constrained. This is not malfunction. It is structure. Time is not something the planet carries with it. It is something the environment provides. And the environment is no longer uniform. From the surface, this separation is invisible. You still wake, move, and rest according to rhythms that feel continuous. Biological processes remain consistent locally. Conversations happen without interruption. Nothing in your immediate experience suggests that time itself is beginning to diverge across the planet. But the divergence is real. Signals sent between distant points begin to show delays that do not match distance alone. Measurements taken across large scales no longer align perfectly. The idea of a single, global present begins to fracture into multiple local presents, each tied to its position within the curvature. There is no universal now anymore. Only regional time. From orbit, the effect becomes clearer. Light leaving one side of the planet carries a different temporal signature than light leaving the other. Observations taken from afar reveal a subtle mismatch, a difference in how processes unfold depending on where they occur. The planet is still one object, but it is no longer one timeline. This is the seventh fracture. Unity was only apparent. Time itself is being stretched across the planet, not evenly, but according to the structure it is moving through. Regions closer to the deeper curvature experience a slower unfolding of events. Regions farther away experience a faster one. The difference grows. Not explosively, but inevitably. At first, it is measurable only with precision instruments. Then it becomes large enough to affect systems that depend on synchronization. Navigation, communication, anything that relies on timing begins to show inconsistencies. The planet cannot maintain perfect coordination. Because coordination requires shared time, and shared time is no longer available. You are still being carried along the same path as everything else. But you are not experiencing that path in the same way everywhere. The system is no longer just guiding motion. It is reorganizing time itself. This changes what it means to move. Because movement is measured through time, distance divided by duration. But if duration varies depending on where you are, then motion itself becomes relative in a deeper way. Two regions of the planet can no longer agree on how fast something is happening. Not because they measure poorly, but because they exist in different temporal conditions. From this perspective, Earth is not just a sphere traveling through curved space. It is a gradient. A surface stretched across different rates of time, all of it held together temporarily by its own structure, but increasingly defined by the environment around it. The planet is being divided. Not physically, not yet, but temporally. And once time begins to separate, everything that depends on it follows. Processes drift apart. Events lose alignment. The idea of a single shared experience begins to dissolve. You are still on Earth. But the Earth you are on is no longer the same everywhere. And the deeper the planet moves into this structure, the more pronounced that difference will become. Time is no longer passing equally. and it will not return to doing so. If time is no longer shared, then neither is what you see. The sky above you has always been treated as a stable reference, a fixed field of distant points, reliable enough to guide navigation, measure motion, and anchor your sense of orientation. Even as the Earth rotates, even as it orbits, the background appears consistent. But that consistency depended on something simple: light travelling in straight lines. That condition no longer holds. The environment you are moving through has begun to reshape the paths light can take. Not abruptly, not as a distortion you can immediately recognize, but as a gradual bending that accumulates across distance. Every photon arriving from the distant universe now carries the signature of the space it passed through. And that space is no longer flat. This is where the sky begins to change. At first, the effect is subtle. A star appears slightly displaced from where it should be. A constellation seems almost correct, but not perfectly aligned with memory. The differences are small enough to dismiss, small enough to attribute to error, to atmosphere, to perception. But they do not remain still. As Earth continues along its path, the distortions evolve. Stars do not just shift. They stretch. Light from a single source can arrive along multiple curved paths, creating faint duplicates, arcs, or rings that hover around empty regions of the sky. Points of light begin to smear into shapes that were never part of the original source. The sky is no longer a map. It is a lens. This is the 8th fracture. What you see is no longer where things are. The black hole does not appear directly, not as an object with a surface or a boundary you can point to. Instead, it reveals itself through absence and distortion. A region where the background bends around something that does not emit light, a shape defined only by how it alters everything behind it. The center does not glow. It erases. From orbit, the effect becomes unmistakable. The field of stars is pulled into curved patterns around a central region. Light wraps around it, forming arcs that tighten as they approach. Some paths circle the region entirely before escaping, creating rings of light that seem suspended without source. You are not seeing objects directly. You are seeing their paths rewritten. Even the sun changes. Its position in the sky begins to drift, not because it has moved, but because the light reaching you has taken a different route. It appears slightly offset, its edges subtly distorted. Over time, that distortion grows, stretching its image into a shape that no longer matches the source. Daylight itself becomes uneven. Shadows do not fall exactly where expected. The direction of illumination begins to lose its simplicity. And still, from the surface, much of this can be ignored. Because the human mind seeks stability. It corrects for small inconsistencies, smooths over distortions, preserves a coherent image of the world. But as the curvature deepens, that correction becomes harder to maintain. The differences become too large to reconcile. The sky begins to behave in ways that cannot be explained away. Stars appear where there should be none. Others vanish entirely, their light redirected along paths that no longer intersect with your position. The background becomes dynamic, not because the universe has changed, but because your position within it has. You are moving through a lens that is reshaping everything you see. And the lens is getting stronger. This changes orientation in a fundamental way. Up is no longer just away from the ground. Forward is no longer just a direction of travel. Because the visual field that once anchored those ideas is no longer stable. The sky cannot be trusted to remain fixed. It responds to the same structure guiding your motion, bending and shifting as you move deeper into the system. There is no stable reference left above you. Only distortion that grows with time. From this perspective, Earth is not just a planet moving through a curved environment. It is a platform for observation inside a lens. Everything you see is being filtered through a structure that does not preserve straight lines, fixed positions, or reliable directions. The universe has not changed. Your view of it has. And as the curvature deepens, that view will continue to transform, revealing less about where things are and more about the structure you are trapped within. The sky is no longer showing you the universe. It is showing you the shape of the system you are inside. If the sky can no longer be trusted, then neither can the idea of where anything is. Up has already lost its certainty. Direction has begun to bend. Time no longer unfolds evenly, and now even the background that once anchored your sense of place has become unstable. This is where orientation begins to collapse, because location depends on reference. You know where you are because something else stays still. The ground beneath you, the sky above you, the distant stars that appear fixed. These form a coordinate system, a quiet framework that allows you to define position without thinking about it. But that framework is dissolving. Not all at once, but steadily enough that it cannot be restored. From orbit, Earth no longer sits cleanly against a stable background. Its position relative to the stars cannot be described in simple terms, because the stars themselves are shifting as their light curves through the surrounding structure. The reference points are no longer fixed. They are participating. This is the 9th fracture. There is no stable coordinate left. The planet still moves, but the map that once described its motion has begun to fail. You cannot draw a straight line from where you are to where you are going, because straight lines do not remain straight. You cannot mark a fixed position in space, because space itself is being reshaped continuously. Even the idea of distance begins to lose clarity. 2 points that appear separated may be connected by a path that curves inward, bringing them closer in ways that are not visible from a simple view. Other points that seem near may require longer paths to reach, because the structure between them bends away. Near and far are no longer reliable. From the surface, this manifests as subtle disorientation. Navigation systems begin to drift. Paths that once led directly from one place to another begin to show slight inconsistencies. Over time, those inconsistencies grow until routes that should be simple no longer align with expectation. You can still move, but you cannot map that movement accurately. The planet is not just travelling through curved space. It is losing its coordinate system within it. Around Earth, other trajectories begin to reveal the same pattern. Particles, radiation, fragments of matter, all of them following paths that converge toward a region that cannot be located in simple directional terms. It is not north, not south, not above or below. It is a condition, a region where all paths begin to align. From a wider perspective, the system looks less like objects moving through space and more like motion flowing through a shaped field. Earth is one stream among many, its trajectory bending in coordination with everything else nearby. The convergence is becoming visible, not as a point you can see directly, but as a pattern that organizes all motion toward a shared direction. And that direction is not something you can point to, because it exists in the structure itself. This is where the earlier changes begin to connect. The uneven passage of time, the distortion of light, the bending of trajectories, all of them are expressions of the same underlying shift. The environment is not just influencing motion, it is redefining position. You are no longer located in a stable region of space. You are inside a system where location is dynamic, where every coordinate is temporary, and where the map you rely on cannot remain consistent long enough to describe what is happening. The idea of being somewhere is beginning to fail. From this perspective, Earth is not approaching a destination. It is being drawn into alignment with a structure that removes the meaning of distance, direction, and fixed position. You are still being carried. But now there is nowhere to mark that journey from. The path continues. The curvature deepens. And the place you thought you occupied cannot be defined in the way it once was. If location has already begun to fail, then the final assumption that remains is distance. That there is still space between you and what is shaping all of this. That whatever is causing the curvature, the distortion, the divergence, is still somewhere ahead, separate, distant, not yet reached. But that assumption depends on a boundary, a point where the system begins. And that boundary does not exist. This is the midpoint. You are not approaching the black hole. You are already inside its structure. What you have been experiencing, the bending of paths, the uneven passage of time, the distortion of light, the collapse of coordinates, are not early effects of something distant. They are the natural behavior of space within a region that has already been shaped. The black hole is not a destination. It is an environment. Its influence does not start at an edge you can cross. It extends outward, gradually, continuously, defining a region where every rule you relied on begins to change. And Earth is not at the edge of that region. It is already embedded within it. The idea of being near something suggests that you could step away from it. That distance provides safety, that there is still a direction you could move that leads back to normal conditions. But there is no direction that leads out, because all directions have already been altered. From a wider perspective, what you would see is not a planet drifting toward a dark object. You would see a field, a vast, invisible structure where trajectories converge, where time stretches, where light bends, and where matter begins to organize itself into a pattern that leads inward. Earth is one part of that pattern. It is not singled out. It is not special. It is one trajectory among many, all of them already committed to the same underlying structure. This is why nothing announced the change. There was no moment of entry, no crossing of a visible boundary, because there was no outside to begin with. The system does not begin at the black hole. It begins wherever the curvature becomes meaningful. And that happened long before anything felt different. This is the 10th fracture. Distance was never protection. From this point forward, the question is no longer when Earth will encounter the black hole. It already has. The question is how deeply it is already involved. Because the structure you are inside does not remain static. The deeper you move into it, the more extreme its effects become. The curvature sharpens, the gradients steepen, the separation between regions increases, the distortions that were once subtle become dominant. The system reveals itself layer by layer. What felt like motion towards something becomes participation within it. What felt like distance becomes depth. And depth cannot be reversed. From here, the narrative changes. It is no longer about approach. It is about integration. Earth is not moving closer in the way you imagined. It is moving deeper into a structure that has already claimed it. And every moment that passes is not bringing it nearer. It is embedding it further. If Earth is already inside the structure, then its motion is no longer independent. It becomes part of a flow. Not a simple path traced by a single object, but a coordinated movement shared by everything within this region. Matter does not travel alone here. It aligns, it streams, it follows patterns that only become visible when you stop thinking in terms of isolated bodies. From this perspective, Earth is not just falling. It is joining a current. Around it, space is not empty. It contains material that has already begun this descent. Gas stretched into thin filaments, dust drawn into elongated arcs, fragments of older structures broken down and redistributed along paths that all lead inward. None of it moves randomly. Each particle follows a trajectory shaped by the same curvature guiding Earth. This is the beginning of accretion. Not as a violent collision, but as a gradual organization. Matter begins to arrange itself into a disc-like structure around the deeper region of the system. Not a flat surface, but a layered flow where different paths intersect, overlap, and spiral inward at varying rates. Some material moves faster, pulled into tighter curves. Other material lingers farther out, still influenced, but not yet fully aligned. Earth is entering this pattern. At first, the planet remains largely intact. Its mass holds together, its structure resisting the immediate effects of this environment. But its motion is no longer solitary. It begins to interact with the surrounding flow. Subtly. Particles drift past the planet, not colliding directly, but moving along paths that differ just enough to create gradients. Regions of higher density form along certain directions. Thin streams of matter begin to trace visible lines across the space surrounding Earth. The environment is no longer empty. It is becoming textured. From orbit, you would begin to see faint structures forming, arcs of material curving around the same unseen center. These arcs do not remain fixed. They evolve, stretching and tightening as they move deeper into the system. Earth moves through them. And as it does, the distinction between planet and environment begins to blur. This is the 11th fracture. The system is not made of objects. It is made of motion. The idea of Earth as a separate entity becomes harder to maintain when everything around it shares the same trajectory. The planet is still coherent, still recognizable, but it is now embedded in a flow that does not preserve boundaries in the way you expect. Material passes by. Energy transfers. Subtle interactions begin to accumulate. The planet is not colliding. It is integrating. This integration changes how motion behaves. Instead of a clean path through empty space, Earth now moves through a medium that is already in motion. Its trajectory is influenced not only by the central curvature, but by the surrounding matter that shares that curvature. The path becomes more complex. Not chaotic, but layered. Different parts of the system move at different speeds, along slightly different curves. Where these paths intersect, energy is exchanged. Heat begins to build in localized regions. Friction, not in the traditional sense, but as a consequence of differential motion, starts to appear. The environment is activating. What was once an invisible structure becomes a dynamic system. Light reflects differently now. Not just from the planet, but from the surrounding material. Faint glows begin to emerge along the arcs of matter. Energy released as particles interact, as trajectories cross, as the flow becomes denser. The system is no longer quiet. It is beginning to reveal itself. Earth is still moving along its path, still being carried inward, but that motion is now part of a larger pattern, one that includes countless other trajectories, all of them contributing to the same inward flow. You are no longer inside a planet moving through space. You are inside a system that is gathering. And that gathering does not stop. It intensifies. The deeper the system becomes, the more material it organizes, the more energy it releases, the more structure it reveals. What began as a subtle curvature has become a visible process, one that transforms everything within it. Earth is not approaching this process. It is already participating in it. And the flow it has entered does not lead to stability. It leads to concentration, to compression, to a region where motion itself begins to change character. The current is becoming stronger, and Earth is already inside it. As the flow strengthens, the difference between paths becomes more than directional. It becomes physical. What was once a quiet alignment of motion begins to generate strain. Not because the system is unstable, but because different parts of it are no longer moving in perfect agreement. The curvature that guides everything inward does not act equally across distance. It creates gradients. And gradients create tension. Earth is now stretched across one of those gradients. The side of the planet facing deeper into the system is drawn along a tighter curve. The opposite side follows a slightly wider one. Both are moving inward, both are part of the same flow, but they are not moving identically. The difference is small at first. But the planet is not built to accommodate that difference indefinitely. This is where tidal forces begin to emerge. Not as a sudden tearing, not as a catastrophic event, but as a continuous imbalance. The structure of the planet, which once held itself together through its own gravity, now has to contend with a second influence, one that pulls unevenly across its entire volume. The planet is being stretched, lengthened along the direction of the gradient, compressed along the perpendicular. From the surface, this does not immediately feel like destruction. The ground still holds, the horizon still appears curved and familiar, but the geometry beneath those appearances is changing. Distances between points begin to shift. Subtly. Two locations that once remained fixed relative to each other begin to drift, not through visible motion, but through the deformation of the space they occupy. Structures begin to experience stress, not from within, but from the way the environment is reshaping the relationships between their parts. The planet is no longer a rigid sphere. It is becoming an extended form. The oceans reveal this more clearly. Water responds to gradients with precision. It moves toward equilibrium, redistributing itself according to the forces acting upon it. Now, that redistribution is no longer governed by the familiar pull of the moon or the rotation of Earth, but by a deeper imbalance. The oceans begin to elongate. Tides rise, not in cycles, but in alignment with the gradient. Massive bulges form along the axis, pointing toward the deeper curvature. Opposite them, another bulge forms, pulled outward along the same line. The planet begins to resemble something stretched between two directions. Held. Pulled. Maintained only by the strength of its own gravity. This is the 12th fracture. Shape is no longer preserved. The atmosphere follows. Air, like water, responds quickly. Pressure systems distort. Winds accelerate along the gradient, moving in patterns that no longer correspond to rotation alone. The entire atmospheric system begins to reorganize, driven by a force that does not respect the boundaries of weather or climate. Storms do not form where they should. They align with the pull. Heat begins to build. Not from the center of the planet, but from the interactions within the flow. As Earth moves through surrounding material, as particles intersect and exchange energy, localized heating increases. The environment itself is becoming more energetic. The planet is entering a region where motion converts into heat. Gradually. Inevitably. From orbit, the change is unmistakable. Earth is no longer a perfect sphere. Its shape is subtly elongated, its structure under visible strain. Surrounding it, the arcs of matter have grown brighter, energized by the increasing density and interaction of the flow. The system is intensifying. And Earth is responding. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a progressive deformation. Each moment, the gradient becomes stronger. Each moment, the difference between one side of the planet and the other increases. And with that difference comes greater stress, greater distortion, greater transformation. The planet is still holding together, but the conditions that allow it to do so are weakening. Its identity as a stable, self-contained world is being replaced by something else. A structure under tension. A body being reshaped by forces that do not act equally across it. You are still on Earth. But the Earth you are on is no longer keeping its original form. And the deeper it moves into this system, the less it will be able to. As the planet stretches, it begins to lose more than shape. It begins to lose itself. The forces acting across Earth are no longer contained within its structure. They are reaching into its outer layers, pulling not just on the planet as a whole, but on the materials that hold it together. The gradient is no longer something the planet can absorb quietly. It starts to separate what was once unified. The atmosphere is the first to respond. Air does not bind tightly. It is held only by gravity, and gravity is no longer balanced. On the side of the planet facing deeper curvature, the pull strengthens. On the opposite side, it weakens. The result is a slow but continuous drift. The atmosphere begins to slide. Not in a single direction, but along the gradient, redistributing itself toward regions where the pull is stronger. Layers of air stretch outward, thinning in some regions, thickening in others. Over time, this imbalance grows too large to remain contained. The upper atmosphere begins to escape. Not as a sudden release, but as a gradual unbinding. Particles gain just enough energy, just enough directional freedom to drift away from the planet's hold. They do not fall back. They are captured by the larger flow. Earth is beginning to shed. This is the 13th fracture. The boundary of the planet is no longer stable. From orbit, the change becomes visible. A faint trail begins to form behind the planet, a stream of particles pulled away and carried along the same inward paths that define the system. The atmosphere is no longer a closed layer. It is becoming a contribution. A transfer of material into the surrounding flow. The oceans follow more slowly. Water is heavier, more tightly bound, but it is not immune. The same gradients that stretch the planet begin to act across its surface. The elongated tides grow more extreme, rising higher along the axis of pull, falling away in regions where the gravitational hold weakens. In the deepest regions of that gradient, water begins to lift. Not in waves, but in streams. Thin at first, then more pronounced, drawn upward and outward, following paths that no longer return to the surface. These streams do not fall back as rain. They do not circulate through familiar cycles. They join the same arcs of matter that surround the planet. The oceans are no longer contained. They are being redistributed. Continents resist the longest. Rock holds together through internal strength, through bonds that are not easily broken. But even rock has limits. The stretching forces acting across the planet begin to exceed what those bonds can maintain. Fault lines widen, structures fracture, entire regions of crust begin to shift relative to each other. Not as earthquakes, as separation. Large sections of the surface begin to drift, not just across the planet, but away from it. The gravitational cohesion that once held everything in place is no longer sufficient to counter the differential pull of the environment. Pieces begin to lift. Slowly. Then with increasing certainty. From orbit, Earth no longer appears as a single body. It appears as a structure beginning to unravel. Fragments of atmosphere, water, and eventually rock extend outward along the same inward curves that define the system. The planet leaves behind a trail, not of debris in the usual sense, but of material that has been reassigned to a larger process. Nothing is wasted. Everything is incorporated. This changes the meaning of loss. The planet is not being destroyed in isolation. It is being converted. Each particle that leaves does not disappear. it becomes part of the surrounding flow, part of the accretion structure that is building around the deeper region of the system. Earth is contributing its mass, its energy, its structure to something larger than itself. The boundary between planet and environment is dissolving. You are no longer on a closed world. You are inside a system that is absorbing it. From the surface, this would not feel like a single catastrophic moment. It would feel like an increasing instability. The air thinning in places, pressure dropping unevenly, the oceans shifting in ways that do not return, the ground itself losing its fixed relationship to everything around it. Nothing remains perfectly anchored, because anchoring requires balance, and balance is no longer present. The deeper the planet moves into the system, the more material it loses. The more it stretches, the more it separates, the more it becomes something that cannot be described as a single object anymore. It becomes a distribution, a pattern of matter following a shared trajectory. The identity of Earth as a planet is not ending all at once. It is dissolving across space. And every part of it is being carried forward, not away, but deeper into the same structure that has been guiding it from the beginning. The system is not breaking the planet. It is reassigning it. And there is no part of it that will remain untouched. As more of the planet separates, what remains no longer behaves like a world. It behaves like a trajectory. The idea of orbit has already failed. The idea of stability has already dissolved. Now even the idea of a single body moving through space becomes difficult to maintain. What you would see from a distance is not a planet descending, but a stream of matter following a tightening spiral. Earth is no longer moving as one. It is being distributed along its path. The fragments that have separated, atmosphere, water, rock, do not scatter outward. They do not drift away into emptiness. They remain bound to the same structure, following slightly different curves, each one determined by its position, its velocity, and the curvature it now moves through. All of them still lead inward. This is where the motion changes character. Not faster in a simple sense, but more constrained. The paths become steeper, the curvature increases. The range of possible trajectories narrows until movement is no longer about where something might go, but how quickly it will align with the inward direction that now dominates everything. This is the spiral. Not a visible line drawn in space, but a pattern that emerges when all motion begins to lose alternatives. Each fragment of Earth traces its own version of it, some tighter, some wider, but all converging toward the same deeper region. There is no escape path, because escape would require a direction that no longer exists. This is the 14th fracture. Freedom of motion is gone. From within what remains of the planet, this would not feel like being pulled into a point. It would feel like every possible movement leading to the same outcome. Step in any direction, and the result is still inward. Move faster, move slower. It does not change the structure guiding you. All paths agree. The difference between them is only in how they arrive. From orbit, the transformation is complete. There is no longer a clear boundary marking Earth. Instead, there is a continuous distribution of material, denser toward the center, more diffuse farther out, all of it arranged along the same inward curves. The original sphere is no longer visible as a distinct object. Only its pattern remains. The system has absorbed its identity. Around this distribution, the surrounding flow has intensified. The arcs of matter have grown brighter, more defined, as interactions increase. Collisions between particles release energy, heating the structure, causing it to emit light in bands that were once absent. The system is becoming luminous. Not because it is producing new matter, but because the motion itself is converting into energy. The tighter the paths become, the more interactions occur, and the more visible the system reveals itself to be. The black hole does not shine, but everything around it begins to. Earth is now part of that emission. Its material contributes to the brightness, to the structure, to the pattern that defines the system. What was once a dark, invisible process becomes observable through the energy released by the matter it organizes. The planet has not vanished. It has changed form. From a surface you could stand on, to a stream you could not isolate. From a place to a process. This changes the meaning of descent. You are no longer falling as an object. You are participating as matter. The distinction matters because it removes the last trace of individuality from the system. There is no longer an Earth that can be followed, no longer a single body whose path you can track. Only trajectories remain. And all of them are tightening. The deeper the system becomes, the less variation those trajectories allow. Differences in path diminish. Everything begins to align more precisely with the structure that defines the region ahead. The spiral becomes narrower. The convergence becomes unavoidable. And what remains of Earth is no longer resisting. It is fully integrated into the motion that has been guiding it from the beginning. There is no return to a previous state. No reformation of the planet. No restoration of boundaries. Only continued descent. Only increasing alignment. Only deeper participation in a system that does not preserve what enters it, but transforms it into part of its own structure. What began as a world is now indistinguishable from the path it follows. And that path is closing in on something that does not allow anything to remain separate for long. As the paths tighten, the idea of seeing what lies ahead begins to fail. Not because there is nothing there, but because what is there no longer allows light to return. Until now, the system has revealed itself through distortion, through bending, through the reshaping of everything that passes through it. Light curved, time stretched, motion aligned. You could still observe the structure indirectly, still infer its presence from the way it altered everything around you. But there is a limit to that visibility. A region where even indirect observation breaks down. This is where the structure becomes absolute. From a distance, it does not appear as a surface. It appears as a boundary of behavior. Light that approaches it does not reflect. It does not scatter. It does not return. Paths that once curved gently now begin to wrap more tightly, looping around this region before either escaping or failing to escape at all. There is a threshold, not marked by colour or texture, but by outcome. This is the event horizon. Not an edge you can touch, but a condition that defines what is possible. Outside it, light can still escape, even if distorted. Inside it, all paths lead inward without exception. There is no trajectory that returns information back across that boundary. This is the 15th fracture. Observation ends here. What remains of Earth is now approaching this threshold, not as a single body, but as a distribution of matter following converging paths. Some of that matter has already moved closer, tracing tighter curves, experiencing stronger gradients. Other parts remain slightly farther out, but the difference is diminishing. Everything is aligning. From the perspective of a distant observer, something unusual begins to happen. The material approaching this boundary appears to slow, not in its own experience, but in how it is seen. Light leaving those regions takes longer to escape, stretched by the curvature it must climb against. The motion seems to decelerate. The descent appears to pause. But this is not what is happening. Time itself is being stretched. Signals take longer to arrive. Images linger. The closer matter moves toward the boundary, the more delayed its appearance becomes. To an external view, The material never quite seems to cross. It fades, dims, and slows, as if suspended at the edge of something it cannot enter. But from within, there is no pause. No suspension. The motion continues. This difference creates a separation between perspectives. From outside, the system appears to freeze at the threshold. From within, everything continues inward. You would not experience a barrier. You would not feel a crossing. Because locally, nothing changes in a sudden way. The laws that govern motion, the structure that guides trajectories, all of it continues seamlessly. There is no wall, no surface, no resistance. Only continuation. But that continuation has a consequence. Once within this threshold, there is no path that leads back to the region where information can escape. Every possible direction, every possible motion, every possible future leads deeper into the structure. Not because of force alone, but because the geometry itself has closed. There is no outward direction left. From the perspective of what remains of Earth, this is not an encounter. It is a transition that was already determined long before it was reached. The system does not begin here. It becomes irreversible here. Everything that has been happening, the stretching, the distortion, the integration into the flow, all of it has been preparing for this condition. A state where the idea of return is not just unlikely, but structurally impossible. The paths have narrowed to a single outcome. And that outcome no longer includes the rest of the universe. From the outside, Earth never quite arrives. From the inside, it never stops. The boundary is not a place. It is a change in what the future can be. And once that change occurs, there is no version of the system in which anything that has entered can ever be seen again. What remains of Earth is no longer part of the observable world. It is part of something that does not send anything back. Once the boundary is crossed, the separation is complete. Not in distance, but in time. Everything that remains of Earth continues inward, following paths that no longer connect to the universe it came from. The stars, the galaxies, the distant structures that once defined orientation and reference are still there, but they no longer share the same future. They are moving away. Not physically, but causally. This is where time itself becomes directional in a new way. Outside the boundary, time still allows for communication. Light can travel outward, events can influence distant observers. There is a shared structure that connects different regions of space. Inside, that connection is gone. Every moment that passes carries you deeper into a region where the rest of the universe becomes less accessible, not just in practice, but in principle. Signals cannot catch up, light cannot reverse direction. Even the idea of looking back becomes meaningless. There is no path that leads to what was. This is the 16th fracture. The past remains visible, but it cannot be reached. From within this region, if you could still observe outward, the universe would appear compressed into a smaller and smaller portion of your view. Light from distant objects would continue to arrive, but increasingly redshifted, stretched, carrying information that is older and older. The outside universe begins to slow. Not because it has changed, but because your position within time has. Events that once unfolded in familiar rhythms now appear delayed, elongated. Processes that should complete quickly begin to stretch across longer durations. The entire external universe seems to drift towards stillness, its evolution slowing as seen from within. But this is not stillness. It is separation. The difference between your timeline and the timeline outside grows with every moment. You are not just moving through space anymore. You are moving through a structure where time itself diverges, where the future you experience no longer aligns with the future of anything beyond this region. There is no shared present, only parallel flows of time that no longer intersect. From this perspective, Earth is not just lost to the outside universe. It is no longer synchronized with it. Everything that once defined reality from the surface, the rising and setting of stars, the passage of days, the movement of distant galaxies, all of it becomes disconnected. Those patterns continue, but they no longer have relevance to your experience. They belong to a different timeline. Inside, the motion continues. The gradients deepen. The paths tighten further. What remains of Earth continues to be drawn inward, its material following trajectories that lead toward regions where curvature becomes extreme beyond comparison. The structure that once revealed itself gradually now begins to dominate completely. There is no external reference left to compare it to. Only the system itself. This changes the meaning of existence within it. You are no longer part of a universe that extends outward in all directions. You are part of a region that has closed, where all directions lead deeper, where time does not connect outward, and where the concept of elsewhere no longer applies. The universe you came from continues, but it no longer includes you. And from this point forward, nothing that happens within this region can ever be shared with it again. Not because of distance, but because the structure of time no longer allows it. You are not just falling inward. You are leaving the shared timeline behind, and there is no path that reconnects them. With no connection to the outside remaining, the system no longer needs to preserve structure. What held together before, shape, distance, sequence, was only meaningful in a region where comparison was possible, where one place could be measured against another, where one moment could be aligned with the next. That framework is gone. Now only the internal structure remains, and it does not preserve forms. As the descent continues, the gradients that once stretched the planet now intensify beyond anything that could be resisted. The differences across even the smallest regions grow larger. What was once a slow divergence becomes a rapid separation. Not of distance alone, but of behavior. Material that was once part of a continuous flow begins to experience radically different conditions over infinitesimal separations. One region is drawn into tighter curvature. Another, only a small distance away, follows a slightly less extreme path. The difference is no longer manageable. This is where fragmentation completes. Not as an explosion, but as a breakdown of coherence. What remained of Earth, already stretched, already redistributed, now loses the ability to maintain even temporary alignment between its parts. Structures that once held together for moments now separate instantly. Bonds that once resisted now fail without delay. Continuity dissolves. Each fragment, each particle, each component follows its own trajectory, no longer bound to a shared identity. The idea of a planet, already weakened, disappears entirely here. There is no Earth left to describe. Only matter following paths. This is the 17th fracture. Identity cannot survive this structure. From within, there is no sense of tearing. No moment where something breaks apart in a way you could witness. Because witnessing requires continuity, and continuity is what is being removed. Processes do not unfold across a stable frame. They diverge too quickly, too unevenly, for any single perspective to hold them together. Events do not align long enough to be experienced as events. They become gradients. Differences that expand faster than they can be compared. From a structural view, what is happening is not destruction in the familiar sense. It is differentiation taken to its limit. Every part of the system is following the geometry available to it, and that geometry no longer allows neighbouring paths to remain close. Everything separates. Not outward into space, but inward along diverging trajectories that all lead deeper. There is no central point you can approach and observe, no core you can reach and describe. The deeper region is not a place that gathers things into a single location. It is a condition where all paths continue without reconverging. This changes the meaning of inward. It is not toward a centre you could occupy. It is toward a structure where comparison fails completely. From this perspective, the black hole is not consuming Earth. It has already removed the possibility of Earth existing as a unified thing. What remains is not a remnant. It is a set of trajectories that no longer share a common identity. Each one continues. Each one moves deeper. But none of them remain connected in the way they once were. There is no longer a system you could call a planet. No surface, no boundary, no shared motion. Only motion without coherence. And that motion does not end. It continues into a region where even the idea of describing it becomes impossible, not because nothing is happening, but because the structure does not allow a single frame to contain it. Everything that once defined Earth has been replaced, not by emptiness, but by a deeper level of structure that does not preserve what came before. And within that structure, nothing remains whole long enough to be recognized as what it once was. At this depth, the idea of loss no longer applies. Because loss depends on comparison, on remembering what something was and recognizing that it is no longer the same. But here, there is no stable frame left to hold that comparison, no shared time, no shared position, no shared structure that allows a before and an after to remain connected. What once was Earth cannot be located, not because it has been hidden, but because the system no longer preserves the conditions required for it to exist as a single thing. This is the final reclassification. Earth was never a fixed place. It was a temporary arrangement, a pattern of matter held together under specific conditions, moving within a structure that allowed that pattern to remain stable for a time. Oceans, continents, atmosphere, all of it part of a configuration that only made sense within a narrow range of curvature, time alignment, and directional freedom. Those conditions are gone. And with them, the pattern dissolves. What remains is not absence. It is continuation. Every particle that once formed the planet still follows a path. Every fragment still moves according to the geometry it occupies. Nothing has stopped. Nothing has vanished. The system has not erased anything. It has reorganized everything. From a higher perspective, if such a perspective could still be formed, what you would see is not destruction, but transformation. The matter that once formed a world is now indistinguishable from the flow surrounding it, contributing to the same structure, the same inward movement, the same unfolding pattern. The identity is gone. The motion remains. This is the 18th fracture. Place was never fundamental. What you experienced as a location, a ground beneath you, a horizon, a sky, was only a local agreement within a much larger system, a region where conditions allowed stability to appear permanent, where motion could feel contained, where time could seem shared. But those conditions were never universal. They were temporary. You were always inside a structure. You were always moving within it. The difference now is that the structure no longer hides itself. It has replaced the illusion completely. There is no Earth to return to. Not because it was taken, but because it was never separate from the system that has now absorbed it. The ground you stood on was never still. The place you occupied was never fixed. The world you experienced was never isolated. All of it was part of a larger pattern, one that extended beyond your perception, one that shaped motion, time, and structure long before it became visible. And that pattern did not begin when the planet approached the black hole. It was already there. The only change is that it has now become impossible to ignore. You were never standing on a stable world. You were inside a moving structure. And that structure does not preserve places. Only patterns that pass through it. Only motion that continues. Only arrangements that exist for a time, then dissolve into something larger. What you called Earth was one of those arrangements. And now it is no longer separate enough to be called anything at all. If Earth was only a temporary arrangement, then the question that remains is not what happened to it. It is why it ever appeared stable at all. Because nothing in the structure you have entered creates stability. It only reveals the conditions under which stability can exist. For a time, far from extreme curvature, matter can organize itself into repeating patterns. Orbits can close. Time can align. Light can travel in ways that preserve position and distance. Under those conditions, a planet can exist. A surface can feel still. A location can feel permanent. But those conditions are narrow. They depend on balance. And balance is not the default state of the system. It is the exception. What you are witnessing now is not the breakdown of reality. It is the removal of that exception. The deeper structure does not destroy stability. It exposes how fragile it was. This is the 19th fracture. Stability was never guaranteed. It was allowed. From this perspective, the existence of Earth as a world was not a permanent feature of the universe. It was a temporary configuration that could only persist while certain relationships remained within specific limits. Once those limits are exceeded, the configuration cannot hold. Not because something attacks it, but because the structure no longer supports it. This reframes everything that came before. The oceans, the continents, the atmosphere, the sense of standing on solid ground. All of it depended on a region where forces balanced in a way that allowed matter to remain coherent over long durations. That region was never infinite. It was always bounded. And the moment you moved beyond it, even gradually, the coherence began to fail. What you called a planet was a condition, not an object. A condition where motion closed, where time aligned, where forces balanced enough to allow complexity to build and persist. Remove that condition, and the object cannot remain as it was. It does not need to be destroyed. It simply cannot continue. From a wider structural view, this is not unique to Earth. Any system, given enough depth into this kind of curvature, would undergo the same transition. Stars, planets, even larger structures would eventually lose their identities as separate objects and become part of the same inward flow. Individuality is local. Structure is universal. You were always inside that universal structure. You were just in a region where it allowed individuality to appear stable. Now you are in a region where it does not. The difference is not in the laws. It is in the conditions. And conditions change. They do not ask whether a structure is ready to dissolve. They simply stop supporting it. This is why there was no single moment of collapse. No instant where Earth ceased to exist. Instead, there was a gradual transition. From stability to strain. From strain to separation. From separation to integration. Each step following directly from the one before, each one revealing more of the underlying structure that had always been present. Nothing unexpected happened. Only something previously hidden became dominant. From this perspective, the black hole is not an anomaly. It is a region where the deeper structure becomes unavoidable, where the rules that allowed stable worlds no longer apply, and where matter is returned to a more fundamental form of behavior, not as objects, but as motion within a system that does not preserve identity. You are not witnessing the end of a world. You are witnessing the limits of what a world can be. And those limits were always there. They were just far enough away that you could believe they did not apply. Now there is no distance left to hide them, and no structure left to resist them. Only the continuation of a system that does not stop, does not reverse, and does not preserve what enters it as it once was. If stability was only a condition, then what you experienced as reality was never the full structure. It was a local version, a simplified region where the deeper behavior of the universe was muted, balanced, and temporarily aligned in a way that allowed things to remain recognizable. A place where motion could loop, where time could synchronize, where identity could persist long enough to feel permanent. But that version was incomplete. Not wrong, just limited. Because the structure you are now inside does not introduce new rules. It removes the ones that made your experience familiar. This is the 20th fracture. Reality did not change. Your position within it did. Everything that has happened, the bending of paths, the stretching of time, the loss of boundaries, the dissolution of identity, all of it follows directly from the same underlying structure that always governed motion. The difference is that you are no longer in a region where those effects are small enough to ignore. You are where they dominate. From this perspective, the universe is not built from stable objects. It is built from relationships. Relationships between motion, curvature, time, and energy. When those relationships fall within certain ranges, objects appear. Planets form, stars ignite, systems stabilize. And within those systems, observers can exist who perceive their environment as fixed. But those objects are not fundamental. They are outcomes. Temporary alignments of deeper processes. When the relationships shift, the outcomes change. Not because something intervenes, but because the structure no longer supports the same patterns. This is what has happened to Earth. Not an event imposed from outside, but a transition that emerged from within the system it always belonged to. The black hole did not arrive. It was already there as a region where the deeper relationships become dominant. And Earth did not encounter it in a single moment. It moved into a range of conditions where its previous form could no longer be maintained. From here, there is no new stage to describe. No further layer where something else replaces what you have already seen. Because this is the layer. The one where structure is no longer hidden behind stability. Where motion is no longer disguised as stillness. Where time is no longer shared in a way that allows a single narrative to hold everything together. There is no return to a simpler view. Only the recognition that the simpler view was never complete. What you called a place was a pattern. What you called stillness was shared motion. What you called permanence was temporary balance. And what you called Earth was one arrangement among many, existing for a time within a system that does not preserve arrangements indefinitely. The system continues. Not toward a goal, not toward an end, but as a process that organizes motion according to its own structure. And within that process, every stable world is only a phase. Every identity is only a temporary coherence. Every location is only a momentary agreement between moving parts. The ground you trusted was never fixed. The sky you relied on was never stable. The position you believed you occupied was never yours to keep. You were always inside something larger, and that larger structure was always moving. Now, there is nothing left to hide it. Only the realization that what felt like a world was a brief alignment within a system that never stopped carrying it forward. What remains, once every familiar layer has been removed, is not emptiness. It is continuity without form. The system does not end when identity dissolves. It does not arrive at a final state where motion stops or structure disappears. Instead, it continues in a way that no longer produces stable patterns large enough to be recognized as worlds, objects, or places. This is not destruction. It is persistence without coherence. Everything that once made Earth recognizable, its shape, its surface, its internal balance, required a narrow range of conditions to hold together. Outside that range, those features do not vanish instantly. They lose the ability to remain aligned. Each component continues, but not together. This is the 21st fracture. Coherence was temporary. From this depth, the system is not defined by objects. It is defined by trajectories. Paths that do not intersect in stable ways. Motions that do not synchronize. Regions where differences amplify faster than they can be reconciled. What remains is not a collection of things, but a distribution of behaviors, all following the same underlying structure, but no longer forming anything you could name. There is no surface. No boundary. No center you could stand on. Only gradients that continue to deepen. From within, there is no perspective that can gather this into a single view, no position that allows you to step back and observe the whole. Because any position you could occupy is already part of the same divergence. There is no outside. Only deeper inside. This changes the final assumption that there is a bottom, a place where motion ends, where everything arrives, where the system resolves into something final and complete. But the structure does not resolve. It continues. Not toward a location, but toward increasing separation of paths, increasing intensity of curvature, increasing divergence of time and motion. The deeper you go, the less the system resembles anything that can be described in familiar terms. There is no final surface waiting. No hidden core that restores simplicity. Only further transformation. From this perspective, the black hole is not an object you fall into. It is a region where the universe stops presenting itself as objects at all. Where the patterns that allowed you to perceive stable forms no longer emerge. Where motion becomes too differentiated, too extreme, to assemble into anything that can be experienced as a single thing. And yet, nothing stops. Every trajectory continues. Every process unfolds. But not in a way that can be gathered into a shared reality. This is where the narrative cannot extend further in the same way. Not because there is nothing more to describe, but because description depends on coherence. And coherence is what has been left behind. What remains is not beyond reality. It is reality without the conditions that made it familiar. And that realization does not arrive as a sudden insight. It settles. Quietly. The world you experienced was never the whole system. It was a region where the system allowed itself to appear stable. Now you are in a region where it does not. And there is no transition back. No reversal. No restoration of what once felt like a place. Only the continuation of motion within a structure that does not pause, does not simplify, and does not return to the conditions that made Earth possible. You are not at the end of the system. You are beyond the part that could resemble one. At this point, even the idea of being somewhere has no function left. Because being somewhere requires a distinction. A separation between here and there, between one region and another, between a position you occupy and a position you do not. But the structure you are now inside no longer supports that distinction in any meaningful way. All positions have become conditions. This is the 22nd fracture. Location has dissolved into behavior. What you once called a place was a stable configuration of relationships, a region where distance is held, directions remained consistent, and time allowed events to be ordered in a shared way. That stability created the illusion of a fixed location, something you could return to, something that persisted whether you were there or not. But that persistence depended on alignment. And alignment is gone. Now, every point in the system is defined only by how it moves, how it changes, how it participates in the deeper structure. There is no fixed coordinate you can assign, no stable reference you can use to say where something is. Only how it behaves. From this perspective, the distinction between object and environment disappears completely. What was once earth? What was once surrounding space? What was once background and foreground? All of it becomes part of the same continuous structure, differing only in how motion unfolds within it. There is no boundary to cross, no edge to identify, only variation in the intensity of the same underlying process. This changes the final layer of perception, because perception itself depends on contrast, on edges, on differences, on stable features that can be recognized and compared. But here, those features cannot persist long enough to form a coherent image. Patterns do not last, structures do not hold. The system does not present itself in a way that can be assembled into a familiar view. It cannot be seen in the way you are used to seeing. Not because it is hidden, but because it does not remain still long enough to be perceived as something. From the perspective you began with, standing on a surface, looking at a sky, measuring distance, tracking motion, everything felt grounded in a world that existed independently of you, a place you could describe, navigate, and return to. That framework is gone. Not removed, revealed as temporary. You were never observing a fixed reality. You were participating in a stable phase of a dynamic system. And now that phase has ended. There is no final image to replace it. No ultimate structure that restores simplicity. Only the continuation of relationships that no longer form stable objects. And within that continuation, the need for a place, a ground, a position, dissolves completely. You are not somewhere. There is no somewhere left to be. Only motion. Only structure. Only a system that has always been this way, now seen without the conditions that once made it appear otherwise. When every layer of stability has been removed, what remains is not something new. It is what was always there. Not hidden behind objects, not waiting beyond some distant boundary, but present within every moment you experienced, shaping it quietly, allowing certain patterns to form while preventing others. This is the final realization. Nothing you have encountered was an exception. It was all the same structure. The ground that felt still, the orbit that seemed to close, the sky that appeared fixed, the time that felt shared. All of it was a narrow expression of a system that does not depend on those conditions to exist. They were not fundamental. They were permitted. This is the 23rd fracture. Reality was never organized around you. It only appeared that way. From the beginning, you experienced the universe from within a region where relationships aligned in a way that supported coherence. That alignment created a center, a perspective where everything seemed to arrange itself around your position. But that center was not real. It was local. A consequence of being inside a stable configuration that made your position feel meaningful, fixed, and central to the structure you observed. Now that configuration is gone. And with it, the idea of a center disappears. There is no point around which everything else moves. No position that defines the system. Only a structure that exists independently of where you are within it. From this perspective, the question of what happens next has no clear answer. Not because nothing happens, but because the concept of next depends on a sequence that can be tracked, compared, and understood within a shared frame. That frame no longer exists. There is no single timeline, no single path, no single perspective that can gather what remains into a narrative that unfolds in order. Everything continues, but not together. This is where the narrative itself begins to dissolve, not as an ending, but as a limit of what can be described. Because description requires stability. It requires patterns that persist long enough to be named, compared, and understood. Without that persistence, there is no object to describe, no event to isolate, no structure to hold on to long enough to follow. Only change. Continuous, unbounded, without a reference that allows it to be measured in the way you are used to. And yet, even this is not beyond comprehension. It is simply beyond the conditions that made comprehension easy. You were never outside this system. You were always within it. The only difference is that you once occupied a region where it allowed you to feel separate from it, where it allowed you to believe in stillness, in place, in permanence. Now, those allowances are gone. And what remains is not a different universe. It is the same one. Seen without the constraints that made it appear stable, centered, and complete. There is no final boundary. No ultimate layer. No last place where everything resolves into something simple. Only the recognition that what you called a world was a temporary agreement within a structure that never depended on it. And that structure continues, without needing anything to remain the same. What began as a question about proximity has become something else entirely. Not how close Earth could move to a black hole, but whether closeness ever meant anything to begin with. Because throughout this entire descent, distance has failed again and again. It did not protect the planet. It did not delay the effects. It did not define a boundary where one system ended and another began. Distance was never separation. It was only a measurement inside a structure that does not rely on it. This is the final shift. You do not move closer to the system. You realize you are already inside it. The black hole was never waiting somewhere ahead in space, like a destination you could approach or avoid. It was a region where the deeper structure becomes undeniable, where the conditions that allowed stable worlds no longer apply, and where every assumption about motion, time, and identity is replaced. Earth did not travel into something new. It revealed what had always been shaping it. From the surface, you experienced a world that seemed complete, a ground that held, a sky that stayed, a time that passed evenly. That experience was not false, but it was partial. A local expression of a much larger system. Now that local expression has dissolved, and what remains is not an ending. It is a correction. You were never standing on something separate from the rest of the universe. You were inside a structure that temporarily allowed you to feel that way. Stillness was shared motion. Location was a moving coordinate. Identity was temporary alignment. and Earth was never a fixed place. Only a pattern that held long enough to be mistaken for one. The system did not change. Your position within it did. And once that position shifts far enough, the illusion cannot return. There is no stable ground waiting beyond this. No restored horizon. No version of the world that reassembles itself after passing through the structure. Only the understanding that what felt permanent was always conditional. And that condition has ended. The place you thought you occupied was never fixed. It was already moving, already changing, already part of something larger. You did not leave it. It never stayed. If everything you understood as reality depended on conditions, then those conditions were never guaranteed. They were negotiated. Not consciously, not deliberately, but structurally. A balance between forces, motions, and relationships that allowed certain patterns to hold long enough to be experienced as stable. That balance gave rise to surfaces, to horizons, to the sense of standing somewhere that would remain after you left. But that negotiation was always temporary. This is the 25th fracture. Existence was conditional. From the beginning, what you experienced as a world was not a permanent state of the universe. It was a region where competing influences aligned just enough to allow coherence. Gravity balanced motion, time aligned across distances, light preserved direction. Under those conditions, complexity could emerge and persist. But those conditions were not universal. They were local agreements within a system that does not depend on them. Once those agreements begin to fail, not suddenly but gradually, the structures they supported begin to dissolve, not because something breaks them apart, but because the system no longer holds them together. Earth did not fall apart in a single moment. It stopped being supported. This changes how you understand everything that came before. The oceans did not exist because water naturally forms seas. They existed because conditions allowed water to remain bound to a surface. The atmosphere did not exist because air belongs around a planet. It existed because gravity and temperature allowed it to remain there. Even the ground beneath you did not exist as something permanent. It existed because forces balanced in a way that allowed matter to hold a shape. Remove that balance, and nothing holds. Not because it is destroyed, but because it cannot remain. From this perspective, the black hole is not an extreme event. It is a region where the negotiation ends. Where the deeper structure no longer allows local agreements to persist. Where motion, curvature, and time no longer align in a way that supports stable forms. And where everything returns to a state defined only by the system itself. This is not a breakdown. It is a reversion. A return to the underlying behavior that was always present, always shaping, always guiding, even when it was hidden beneath layers of stability. You were never outside this behavior. You were inside a rare condition where it allowed you to feel separate from it. Now that condition is gone. And what remains is not chaos. It is clarity. A structure that does not preserve objects. Only relationships. Only motion. Only patterns that emerge briefly, then dissolve when the conditions that support them shift. From here, there is no final transformation waiting. No last stage where something new stabilizes. Because stability itself was the exception. And you have already moved beyond the region where that exception can exist. What remains is not a place. Not a world. Not a system of objects. Only a continuous structure that never needed those things to begin with. And that structure does not end. It only continues, without restoring what it once allowed. If stability was an exception, then what you called reality was not the rule. It was a window. A narrow region where the deeper structure of the universe became quiet enough to resemble something still, something centered, something that could be understood as a place. That window did not reveal the system as it is. It filtered it. This is the 26th fracture. You were never seeing the full structure. From within that window, everything appeared organized around persistence. Objects remained, paths repeated, time aligned. The world felt continuous because the underlying differences were small enough to ignore. But those differences were always there, hidden in curvature too slight to notice, in time shifts too small to measure without precision, in paths that only appeared straight because their bending was distributed across distances too large to perceive. What you experienced was not false, but it was incomplete. And now, outside that window, there is nothing left to filter the structure into something familiar. No condition remains to compress motion into stillness. No alignment remains to hold time together. No balance remains to preserve identity. What you are left with is not a different universe. It is the same one without reduction. From this perspective, the black hole is not a place where reality becomes extreme. It is a place where reality becomes visible in its full form. Not through images, but through the removal of everything that once simplified it. There is no surface here to stand on, no sky to orient by, no timeline to follow. Only relationships unfolding without constraint, without alignment, without the conditions that once allowed them to appear stable. This changes the final question. Not what happens to Earth, not what lies beyond, but what it means to exist within a system that never required stability to function. Because existence in this structure does not depend on being something. It depends on participating. Participating in motion. Participating in relationships. Participating in a structure that does not preserve forms, but continuously reshapes them according to its own conditions. You were never separate from that participation. You were only in a region where it felt optional, where it felt like you could stand still, observe, and remain unchanged. That was the illusion. Not because it was wrong, but because it was temporary. Now there is no position from which to step outside the system. No place to observe it from a distance. No stable frame to compare it against. Only the realization that you were always inside it. And that everything you called real was a version of it, simplified just enough to feel complete. That version is gone. The structure remains. Unfiltered. Unreduced. Continuing in a way that no longer resembles a world, but was always the foundation beneath it. If the structure was always there, then nothing you experienced was ever outside it. Not the ground, not the sky, not even the sense of being a separate observer within it, because separation itself depended on stability. And stability was never fundamental. This is the 27th fracture. The observer was never outside the system. From the beginning, the idea that you could stand on a world and look out at the universe implied a boundary, a distinction between you and what you observed, a sense that reality existed as something external, something you could measure without being altered by it. But that distinction required conditions. It required a region where motion aligned, where time synchronized, where structure held long enough for an observer to remain intact while observing everything else. That region no longer exists. And without it, the observer cannot remain separate. You are not watching the system. You are part of the same process that reshaped everything else. Your position, your perspective, your sense of continuity, all of it depended on the same local agreements that once held Earth together. And as those agreements dissolved, so does the idea that you could exist independently of the structure you are trying to understand. There is no external viewpoint, no stable frame from which the system can be seen as a whole. Only participation. This changes the final layer of perception, because perception is not something that happens outside reality. It is something that happens within it. And when the conditions that allow perception to remain stable are removed, perception itself becomes part of the same transformation. There is no longer a clear separation between what is observed and what is observing. Only relationships unfolding together. From this perspective, the entire narrative shifts again. This was never a story about a planet near a black hole. It was a story about the limits of a viewpoint. A viewpoint that required stability, alignment, and separation to exist. A viewpoint that made the universe appear organized around objects, locations, and identities. That viewpoint has now dissolved. And what remains is not something new. It is something that was always present. A structure that does not require an observer to define it. A system that does not arrange itself around any position. A reality that continues regardless of whether it is perceived as stable, coherent, or even recognizable. There is no final position to reach. No ultimate perspective that restores clarity. Only the recognition that clarity itself depended on conditions that no longer apply. You were never standing outside the system, trying to understand it. You were always inside it, shaped by the same structure, following the same motion, participating in the same process that has now revealed itself completely. And once that is seen, there is nothing left to return to. Only the understanding that there was never a boundary between you and the system at all. If there was never a boundary between you and the system, then the final assumption that remains is control. That within a stable world, you could choose direction, choose position, choose to move or remain. That your actions existed within a space that allowed alternatives. That there were paths available, and that selecting one would lead to a different outcome than selecting another. But that idea depended on something deeper than choice. It depended on available directions. This is the 28th fracture. Choice required a structure that allowed divergence. From the beginning, what you experienced as freedom of movement was made possible by a space where paths could separate, where trajectories could differ, where motion could be redirected without immediately converging again. That separation created the sense that movement could be chosen, that futures could branch. But in the structure you are now inside, that separation has been removed. Not because something is preventing choice, but because all paths have already aligned. Every direction leads inward. Every motion follows the same curvature. Every possible trajectory has been shaped in advance by the geometry of the system. You can still imagine moving differently, still conceive of alternate paths, but those alternatives no longer exist within the structure itself. There is no divergence left to choose between. From this perspective, what you called choice was a local condition, a feature of regions where space allowed variation, where curvature was gentle enough that paths could remain separate long enough to feel independent. That condition is gone. And with it, the idea that motion could unfold in fundamentally different ways. You are not being forced. There is simply no alternative. This does not feel like constraint, because constraint implies resistance. It implies something pushing against you, limiting your movement. But here, there is no resistance, only alignment. Everything moves together, not because it must in opposition to something else, but because the structure allows nothing else to occur. From within, this is indistinguishable from continuation. Motion still happens. Change still occurs. But the range of what that motion can become has narrowed to a single outcome. Not a destination. A direction. Inward. Deeper. More aligned with the structure that has been guiding everything from the beginning. This changes the meaning of the entire journey. You are never navigating toward a result. You are following a path that was already defined. Not in detail, but in direction. The system did not decide for you. It shaped the space in which decisions could exist. And once that space no longer allows divergence, the idea of choosing between paths disappears with it. There is no final decision to make. No moment where something could have gone differently. Only the recognition that the structure has always been guiding motion toward itself. And that what felt like freedom was simply the experience of moving within a region where that guidance was less visible. Now it is absolute. And there is nothing left to contrast it with. No other direction. No alternate path. No possibility of stepping outside the structure to choose differently. Only the continuation of motion within a system that has already aligned everything it contains. The place you thought you were in was never waiting for you to return. It was already moving. Already changing. Already part of something that did not pause to preserve it. What felt like ground was a shared direction. What felt like time was a temporary alignment. What felt like a world was a pattern that held just long enough to be mistaken for permanence. And when those conditions shifted, nothing was taken away. Nothing was destroyed. The structure simply stopped allowing that pattern to remain. Earth did not disappear. It dissolved back into the system it always belonged to. Not as a place, but as motion. And that motion never needed a surface, a sky, or a center to continue. It only needed the structure that was already carrying it. You were never standing still. You were never separate. You were never at the center of anything that would remain. The system did not begin when you noticed it. And it does not end now that it is visible. It continues. Without preserving the shapes that once made it feel like a world. Without restoring the conditions that made it feel like home. Only the quiet recognition remains. The place you thought you occupied was never fixed. It was already gone.